He walked onto that cliff without a single weapon in his hands. His own commanding officer had already tried to have him thrown out of the army. They called him a coward before he ever fired, before he ever refused to fire a single shot. Then, on a 400-foot wall of coral soaked in blood, the men who mocked him watched him lower body after broken body down a rope, alone, under fire, night after night. He never once picked up a gun. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a man who refused to touch a rifle became one of the most decorated soldiers to walk off Okinawa alive, and why the same men who once wanted him gone would later say he saved their lives. Lynchburg, Virginia, 1919. A boy is born into a house that takes one commandment more seriously than almost any family in America. Thou shalt not kill. Not a suggestion, an absolute law carved into how Desmond Doss would see the entire world. His family was Seventh-day Adventist. No work on the Sabbath. No taking a human life for any reason, under any flag. Picture a kid growing up in rural Virginia, watching newsreels of a world sliding toward war, knowing that if it ever came for him, he would not be allowed to touch a weapon. Not one. Most people hear that and assume the same thing. He must have wanted to hide from the war. That's the myth. That's not what happened. Because here's where it gets strange. Desmond Doss didn't want to run from the war. He wanted to serve in it. He just refused to kill in it. In 1942, almost nobody thought those two things could exist in the same man. He had a job at a naval shipyard in Newport News, the kind that came with an automatic deferment. He could have sat out the entire war, and no one would have blamed him. He walked away from it anyway. On April 1st, 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the United States Army, a devout man who refused to carry a rifle, walking straight into an institution built around carrying one. His commanding officers didn't know what to do with him, and what happened next in basic training would almost get him thrown out of the Army entirely. His commanding officers didn't know what to do with him. And what happened next, it wasn't against the enemy. It was against his own unit. He refused to touch a rifle. He refused weapons training entirely. The Army had a label for men like him: conscientious objector. Doss hated that term. He preferred conscientious cooperator. He wasn't there to object to anything. He was there to help. Just never to kill. His fellow soldiers didn't see it that way. To them, a man who wouldn't carry a gun into combat wasn't a cooperator. He was a liability, someone who might get them killed while he stood there with empty hands. They mocked him. They pressured him. Some tried to have him discharged before he ever left the country. Think about that for a second. This man hadn't even seen combat yet, and his own side was already trying to push him out. But Doss held his ground. He trained as a medic instead, learning how to stop bleeding, how to splint a shattered limb, how to keep a dying man breathing long enough to get him off the field. While the men around him learned to take lives, Doss quietly mastered the opposite skill entirely. He didn't know it yet, but that choice, the one that made him a target back home, would soon make him something else entirely on the other side of the world, because the Pacific was waiting, and on islands most of these men had never heard of, Desmond Doss was about to prove exactly what an unarmed man could do under fire. 1944, the Pacific Theater. Desmond Doss now belonged to the Medical Detachment, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, a unit about to be thrown into some of the deadliest fighting of the entire war. Guam came first, then Leyte, two island battles where the jungle itself seemed to fight alongside the enemy. Heat, disease, terrain that swallowed men whole. And in the middle of it, medics dropped like everyone else, except they ran toward the wounded instead of away from them. This is where the doubters got their answer, because Doss didn't hesitate. He didn't hide. He crawled into open fire again and again to drag wounded men back to safety. The same man they'd once tried to kick out of the army for refusing a rifle. He earned the Bronze Star Medal on Guam. Then he earned an oak leaf cluster to go with it on Leyte, recognition for actions most soldiers would need weeks to recover from, let alone repeat. Word started to spread through the unit. The men who once mocked him began to change their tone. Maybe he wasn't a liability after all. But nothing that happened on Guam or Leyte could have prepared any of them for what was waiting on the next island. A place with cliffs, caves, and a name that would follow Desmond Doss for the rest of his life. Okinawa, April 1945. Okinawa. The 10th Army hit the beaches at Hagushi with almost no resistance. That should have been a warning, not a relief. The Japanese weren't waiting on the beach. They were waiting inland, dug into a wall of coral that American soldiers would come to call Hacksaw Ridge, 400 feet of sheer rock. Officially, it was the Maeda Escarpment. The men who had to climb it gave it a different name entirely, the kind of name that tells you everything about what happened there. On April 29th, the 307th Infantry, Doss's regiment, moved in to relieve the exhausted men who'd tried and failed to take it. That night, soldiers hauled 4 50-foot ladders and 5 cargo nets to the base of the cliff. There was no other way up. May 1st, Company A went first, using the ladders. Every single man who stood up at the top was killed or wounded. Not most, not many. Every one. Company B tried the cargo nets instead, and by nightfall they'd gotten 2 platoons onto the edge. Then, around midnight, the Japanese counterattacked and threw them straight back off the cliff. This was the battlefield Desmond Doss was about to climb into, a place where caves and tunnels hid an enemy that couldn't be seen, where the official army history would later describe the fighting in 4 blunt words: all hell rolled into one. And somewhere in that hell, an unarmed medic was about to do something no one on that ridge would ever forget. May 2nd, the fighting for Hacksaw Ridge had barely begun, and Desmond Doss was already doing what no one expected. A wounded soldier lay 200 yards forward of the American lines, exposed to rifle and mortar fire. Doss went out to get him. No weapon, no cover, just a medic bag and a decision he'd already made a long time ago. 2 days later, it happened again. Worse. May 4th, 4 wounded men pinned near a Japanese-held cave. Doss advanced to within 8 yards of the enemy position, 8 yards, and made 4 separate trips to bring each man out alive. That same day, the 307th killed an estimated 600 Japanese soldiers fighting for that same stretch of ground. May 5th brought no relief. Doss reached a wounded artillery officer under direct shelling, moved him to cover, and gave him plasma with his bare hands shaking from adrenaline, not fear. Later that day, he crawled toward another wounded man, lying just 25 feet from enemy fire, then carried him 100 yards back to safety. But the moment that would define him wasn't the running, it was the lowering. One by one, Doss tied wounded men into a rope-supported litter and lowered them down the face of that 400-foot cliff, alone, exposed, working the rope himself while bullets cracked around him. The soldiers later said they heard him praying under his breath between every single man. "Dear God," he reportedly said, "let me get just one more man." He got far more than one. But Okinawa wasn't finished with him yet. May 21st, near Shuri. Weeks of non-stop rescues should have used up whatever luck a man had left. Doss's luck ran out that night. During a night attack, while other soldiers dove for cover, Doss stayed exposed, treating wounded men in the open, the same way he'd done for over 3 weeks straight. Then a grenade landed near him. The blast tore into his legs. Seriously wounded, unable to walk, still surrounded by gunfire, Doss didn't call for help first. He treated his own wounds himself. Then he waited. 5 hours. 5 hours lying in the dark on a battlefield before litter bearers finally reached him. You'd think that would be the end of it. It wasn't. While being carried out, Doss spotted a more critically wounded soldier nearby. He gave up his own litter for the other man. Almost immediately after, he was hit again, this time a bullet shattering his arm, a compound fracture that left the bone exposed. Most men would have gone still and waited to die. Desmond Doss splinted his own arm using a rifle stock, a weapon he had never once fired in his entire life, and crawled 300 yards over broken, torn ground to reach an aid station. Alone, broken, still alive. Okinawa was finally done with him, but America wasn't finished honoring him yet. Late May 1945. Desmond Doss was evacuated off Okinawa. Broken legs, a shattered arm, and a body that had given everything it had left to give. He would carry pieces of that battle in his body for the rest of his life. Months passed. The war in the Pacific ended, and in Washington, someone had been reading the reports. On October 12, 1945, on the lawn of the White House, President Harry S. Truman stood in front of Desmond Doss and placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, the nation's highest award for valor in combat, given to a man who never once carried a weapon into that combat. Think about what that moment actually meant. 2.5 years earlier, this same man had been mocked in his own unit, nearly discharged for refusing to touch a rifle. Now, the President of the United States was looking him in the eye. Truman reportedly told him, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this." Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, not despite his refusal to kill, but because of what that refusal drove him to do instead. But the men who mocked him back in basic training were about to say something no one expected. My Captain Jack Glover. He was one of the officers who, back in basic training, tried to have Desmond Doss removed from the unit entirely. He thought an unarmed medic was a danger to everyone around him. He was wrong, and he knew it. Years later, Glover said it plainly. He was one of the bravest persons alive. The same man he once wanted gone had personally saved his life on that ridge. Desmond Doss went home to Virginia, carrying wounds that never fully healed. He lived quietly for decades, largely out of the spotlight, until his story reached a far wider audience through film and documentary. But long before Hollywood ever told it, the men who survived Hacksaw Ridge with him already knew the truth. He died on March 23, 2006, at 87 years old. By then, history had already settled the argument his own unit once started. Desmond Doss never fired a single shot in World War II, and somehow that's exactly what made him one of the most decorated soldiers to walk off that island alive. The man they once wanted gone became the man none of them could ever forget. If this story moved you, the next one might hit even harder. A Navy SEAL, alone in the mountains of Afghanistan, hunted by an entire enemy force after his entire team was wiped out around him. The story of Marcus Luttrell, the lone survivor, is coming up next on this channel. Subscribe to Valor Untold Stories so you don't miss it.